It might be hard to imagine, but this photograph you're looking at right now is a genuine warship from the year 1861. And the time frame is no coincidence. Let me explain. The American Civil War, a brutal conflict, was pitting the country against itself as the rebellious Confederate government fought the Union over the election of Lincoln, as well as the preservation of slavery. Although most of us know about the background of the Civil War from a political and social standpoint, today we're going to explore things from a different angle. Perhaps one of the most bizarre of which was one of the first large naval battles of the war, the Battle of the Hampton Roads, where for the first time in naval history, two ships armored entirely in steel fought one-on-one in an encounter that changed all of naval warfare for centuries. One ship, the USS Monitor, would be the ultimate victor and the face of that change. Even so, she's now mostly forgotten, with parts of the ship scattered across museums, while the rest lie in the sands of the East Coast. So what's the story of the Monitor, and how did she help bring about a new age in naval warfare? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover a forgotten story. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Navy battles can be just as decisive as those on land, and the strategies employed by both sides of fighting forces are fascinating and ingenious. So before we get started here, I wanted to take a moment and invite everyone who's deeply passionate about this topic to check out our sponsor, World of Warships Legends. What's unique about this free multiplayer game is the combination of quick reflexes and strategy. Plan your moves like a chess game at sea, and enjoy fast-paced battles on maps designed for intense combat, from 9 versus 9 to unique 4-team formats of 3 each. There are ships from 11 nations, and the fleet expands every 5 weeks with new missions and ships. So with over 8 million players, you have over 400 ships, 20 maps, and 100 commanders to explore. Plus, the game controls are easy to learn, and you can become an expert commander after just a few battles, and all from the comfort of your home. But it gets better. From August the 8th to September the 8th, World of Warships Legends is partnering with Battleship Texas Foundation, and you can join the unique experience with our charity, DLC Pack, to help restore the USS Texas. The pack includes the Texas ship, an American commander crate, 15 American ARC camos, 15 rare battle boosters, and a token for an exclusive special mission where you can earn additional rewards. Finally, if you register on the Screen Rant website with your Xbox account, you can participate in the raffle. You could win a custom-made exclusive console by playing 5 battles on Xbox in World of Warships Legends. And remember, you have time until September the 8th, so don't wait any longer. Click the link in the description and join the raffle. Thank you, World of Warships, for supporting our channel, and now, back to the story of the USS Monitor. As I said before, most of us know about the background of the Civil War from a political and social standpoint, so we won't be focusing on that here. Rather, we need to set the scene on a technological and strategic approach, starting with the Union's grand strategy. Union General Winfield Scott proposed the Anaconda Plan at the start of the war. This strategy called for a massive expansion of the Army and Navy to cut the Confederacy off at 3 choke points: the West Texas border, the Mississippi River, and the major Confederate seaports. The Army's job would take the duration of the war, long after Winfield Scott was replaced by an ever-changing list of commanding officers in Lincoln's war cabinet. Still, the Navy's expansion at this time was unparalleled in American history. For context, the First Continental Navy was disbanded after the end of the American Revolution, and the majority of its ships were returned to merchant companies across the East Coast. The Navy Act of 1792, prepared under President Washington and approved by a young Congress, built the first United States Navy for the sake of fighting piracy, not European empires, so its size was never large enough to be more than a patrol and deterrent force, operating rarely beyond the continental shelf. With that in mind, the Anaconda Plan forced Congress to approve the largest naval buildup in American history, which would remain perhaps its largest accomplishment until the Great War half a century later. But to do this, they needed shipyards and builders. But unfortunately, not all of the Union's greatest shipyards remained under their control during the South's secession. Of grave concern to the Union was the large Gosport Naval Yard in the rebel state of Virginia. Founded in 1767 in Portsmouth, the port had already had a harder history than many of its naval peers, as it was burned by the British Army during the Revolutionary War, only to later come under siege from the growing Confederate militias and collaborating civilians. This is when Port Commander Charles Macaulay was placed in an impossible position. His soldiers and sailors evacuated with what ships they could, attempting to set the facility on fire to sabotage the rebels. However, there was one ship meant for the new United States Navy that would have a completely different story. The USS Merrimack would be the only ship successfully set on fire and sunk during the retreat to sea. This was a tragic turn of events, as the 275-foot long and 51-foot wide ship was one of the newest steamships in the U.S. Navy, and was still being finished at the outbreak of the war. When the commanders believed that the port was no longer secure, they set fire to the ship, causing it to sink at anchor on the night of April the 19th, 1861. However, Confederate evaluation revealed that there was relatively minor damage to the port, hence they scavenged, redistributing all of its captured guns. This is when they saw the Merrimack below the waterline, and astonishingly, the machinery was still intact, and now submerged in a saltwater estuary. The Confederates, desperate to use any asset they could, salvaged the ship and began transforming it into a new breed of warship. By 1861, steam power was widely used by all major navies, but ships were still primarily made of wood. In fact, the year the war started, less than 10 ships were built fully from iron between the two largest world navies, Britain and France, although ironclad anchor batteries were somewhat more common across Europe. This was a pinnacle moment. The choice was made to rechristen her as the Ironclad CSS Virginia, using the destroyed Merrimack to provide the best possible chance of resisting the larger Union Navy, which, upon getting word of this massive reconstruction, aggressively began pursuing design challengers to the Ironclad Virginia. And so it was. The naval arms race was on. If the Navy were in this position today, Congress would conduct a lengthy series of reviews and then decide how to respond. The response could include building a weapon to breach the armor or destroy the ship. At the same time, the repairs or general combat improvement were being made for the rest of the Navy. You might also be surprised to learn that the Navy effectively crowdsourced its desire to have a new warship capable of defeating the Confederate Ironclad. Ads paid for by the Navy outlined the Navy's desire to contract any designer and shipyard capable of building an ironclad of their own. The aim was a steam-powered ship between 10 and 16 feet in draft, with an armament of at least 80 tons, accommodating provisions and stores for up to 300 sailors and Marines. This approach was taken because, while the country had experienced building a navy, no one in the wider world knew what a proper ironclad warship was. Hence, by proposing this to almost every architect, iron mill, and shipyard on the northeast coast, the Navy cleverly diversified answers and opportunities. In other words, the odds were that at least one catch with a wide net would be worth it. In the end, 2 designs were accepted out of the dozens given to the Navy for vetting. A third proposal by an experienced naval engineer named John Ericsson was refused. Ericsson had worked for the Navy before, but due to an accident on a ship he designed, was on the Navy Department blacklist as a scapegoat. He had also proposed a version of this design to the French Navy during the Crimean War, but had made no progress in building it. Even so, it was the designer of one of the 2 accepted ironclads before his, Cornelius Bushnell, who became convinced by Ericsson's ship and got him into contact with Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles and, eventually, President Lincoln. Ericsson managed to persuade them both to help him get removed from the blacklist, and his design would become the 3rd approved ironclad in the United States. Ericsson's ship's advantage compared to the previous contract winners was in its straightforward design. The Monitor would be a fully steel-armored ship with a shallow draft for coastal operations, full steam propulsion, and a single propeller providing speed between 8 and 6 nautical miles. It would have been a single flat deck barely over the waterline and a large turret amidship armed with 2 11-inch smoothbore cannons. The armor around the raft's main deck was between 3 and 12 inches, depending on the location. This rotating gun was built with 8 inches of layered iron sheeting. Not a single continuous layer, as no mill could forge iron of that thickness at that time. Ericsson's design, however, wasn't like turrets as we know them today. Without rollers or bearings, the Monitor's turret was housed on top of a 9-inch thick iron spindle at the center, while clock-like gears powered by a separate steam engine propelled the turret clockwise or counter. Because of this, it was tough to change where the turret was aiming without stopping and reversing the engine. But still, it was an amazing advancement, and the Monitor was in action. Its turret would practically constantly spin like a carousel. And that was not the only design flaw. You see, there was no way to check the aim of the main guns, as the only openings in the walls of the turret were the gun ports, which were designed to close between shots while the cannons were reloaded. The only other areas to aim the cannons were either on the top of the turret with telescopes or a small pilot house above the ship's bow, which had abysmal visibility. In fact, there was no way to provide accurate fire control to the turret, something successors would have to innovate on and correct. The water tightening of the turret's floor was also flawed and would cause numerous issues in the ship's brief service life. There was also only one hatch through the floor to the power room, where cannons and gunpowder were stored. This was also completely suboptimal, as while the turret was traversing, the guns couldn't fire more than a few shots between ceasing the rotations and bringing up more ammunition. Despite these flaws, and being the smallest of the first 3 ironclads, she was a revolutionary ship. And while her sea speed was lackluster, Ericsson, turret designer Theodore Timby, and the Continental Iron Works of Greenport promised speed in her delivery. Laid down on October the 25th, 1861, she launched on January the 30th of that same year, to a crowd publicly betting on whether the unique, low freeboard, top-heavy ship would even stay afloat. To many surprise, she did, and was commissioned on February the 25th under Lieutenant John L. Worden. She was officially named Monitor by Ericsson because she would be on the lookout for violent and illegal activities in the fleet, and if need be, personally dispense justice for it. And it wouldn't take long, as in the next month, she would go on to do just that. With reports that CSS Virginia was commissioning herself and potentially preparing to force an opening through the Union blockade of Richmond, Monitor was sent out early in March, arriving on the 9th after rebel warships had wreaked havoc on Union ships sent to delay her. 2 frigates, Congress and Cumberland, were sunk. The 3rd, Minnesota, was heavily damaged and left aground. Still, with leaks below the deck from the ramming bow getting stuck and eventually snapped off and sinking Congress, Virginia retreated to effect repairs. This is when Virginia moved to finish off the Union vessel on the morning of the 9th, and the moment that Monitor came between them. The 2 ships got into a heated cannon duel, described by spectators as slow and clumsy. Thus began the most unique, if not in some perverse way comical, naval battle of all time. The 2 revolutionary ships lapped Hampton Roads for hours, unable to finish each other off. Virginia's captain hadn't known the Monitor was coming, and loaded his ship in the morning purely with high explosive shots to finish off the Minnesota and any other wooden ships coming to assist her. Add that fact to the Monitor's minimal target profile, the few hit shots did no more damage than to the pilot house and Lieutenant Morgan. While Monitor, on the other hand, was loaded with solid-shot armor-piercing shells, the 11-inch cannons she was armed with were not what she intended to use. This is because Ericsson planned to use 15-inch cannons, but before Monitor's duel, those cannons had no practical numbers. Moreover, the 11-inch cannons weren't enough to penetrate the layers of iron around Virginia. Hence, Monitor ran circles around her opponent as the turret crew struggled to keep their bearings and rate of fire, even as the heat rose throughout the day and with every burst from the twin cannons. The only severe damage to the ships was to Virginia, where the wooden backing behind the laminated iron came off in splinters from the Union warship's repeated hits, injuring the crew and gradually increasing damage to the ship's armored skin. This added to damage from the previous day, opening sloppy repairs up after a failed ramming attempt. causing the Virginia to retreat while the second officer of the Monitor was taking command from the injured Lieutenant Morgan. Both continued to lure their opponent into a second duel, but the second battle never came, since ultimately they knew that they couldn't finish their foe off. Monitor would join other Union warships for shore and fortress bombardments during a planned invasion of Virginia led by the then commander of the Union Army, George McClellan, and his eventual replacement, Robert Tyler. With her support and the Union's numerical superiority, Gosport Naval Yard was burned by the Confederates and captured in May, being renamed to its current title, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, which still serves as probably the most important naval base in the US. Anyhow, with no home to return to, no way to run upriver, and no hopes of surviving at sea, CSS Virginia was run aground to have her cannons removed and ammunition stores set on fire, ending her story with an explosion visible for miles. And with that, the Union blockade knew that the rebel Ironclad had been destroyed. When the Peninsula Campaign finally ended, two things happened. The first was that the Navy ordered a new class of ships in the vein of Monitor. These ships, the Pacific class, improved the Monitor's concept with deeper drafts for better seafaring. They were specified to be armed with 11 and 5-inch cannons in case they encountered future Confederate ironclads. The Pacifics also moved the troublesome pilot house to the turret since the Monitor could not fire with her guns directly ahead, without potentially decapitating the ship's commanding officer, that is. The second decision was to move the Monitor to the most troublesome Confederate-held port in North Carolina. At the tail end of 1962, Monitor set sail with USS Rhode Island to eventually meet a large squadron for blockade duty. During this voyage, the ship's poor seafaring reared its ugly head as the crew struggled to patch up any areas that might let water collect. And then, the weather worsened on the morning of December the 30th, and at this point, Rhode Island struggled to keep her under tow. When the ropes snapped, the ironclad lost stability, and the leaking became even worse. The two ships and their sailors fought the flooding into the darkness of the night, and even as it became apparent that the ship was going down. Finally, at 10 p.m., water was a foot deep in the engine room. Pumps were struggling and coal was soaked and refusing to burn. At 10:30, the ship lit its red distress signal, and by 11, the water was threatening to reach the fires, keeping the boilers alive. In the end, Rhode Island sent out her boats once it became clear that the Monitor could not be saved. 16 sailors were lost at sea, while the remainder of the crew escaped to the paddle steamer. Monitor keeled over and sank, with several men tragically stuck inside. And from here, it seemed as though the first American ironclad would be lost forever. In 1950, the US Navy decided to test one of many newer radars by searching for the wreck. But despite spotting what probably was the Monitor off the coast of North Carolina during the trial, no further investigations or even dives were made to confirm or deny this. Later, in 1955, a private search expedition using wire dragging techniques thought they found it at about 50 meters depth and 2 miles offshore, but no further expeditions could prove this. After all, there were quite a lot of wrecks in the area. However, in 1970, Captain Perkins of the Naval Research Laboratory confirmed through Rhode Island's logbooks that this location was inaccurate. It would only be later when a geological survey would eventually identify the Monitor in their spare time after they realized, based on those same logs and other naval wrecks known worldwide, that the Monitor was quite possibly upside down, changing the search profile completely, since her turret was literally under the ship. Basically, with the keel up, she would have looked like just another set of rocks or shoal, as opposed to as if she was right side up. A further expedition eventually proved that this was the Monitor. Ideas were floated to recover the wreck, as it was well within the reach of even amateur divers or scrap metal collectors. One plan called for the deep sea survey ship Glomar Explorer, which the CIA had previously hired to attempt to steal a sunken Soviet submarine in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Plans were put on hold until 1990, when yet another ship accidentally anchored on top of the wreckage, causing significant damage to the unarmed keel. Large parts of the ship were recovered, including the anchor and the propeller, which, after being placed in conservation tanks and studied, were used as proof that the entire wreck could not be salvaged intact. The last pieces of ships permitted to be salvaged were artifacts from the engine room, the engines themselves, and finally, the turret. The engine was pulled from the seabed in 2001, while the turret was pulled up the following year. They were rapidly treated and repaired and are on display to this very day at the Mariners Museum in Virginia, not far away from where she and the Virginia had their fateful duel. While the original components would not be used, the Mariners Museum would even commission a full-scale replica of the Monitor for visitors' viewing pleasure. 2 replicas of the turret are on display there. One of these shows the approximate level of decay the interior suffered after its century and a half underwater. The second is only a partial replica, showing the turret's interior as designed. But the real prize sits in 2 large tanks, which are basically inaccessible aside from a small viewing gallery. These 2 specially designed tanks have the largest remaining pieces of the Monitor, the engines, and the turret stored in them. These specially designed tanks are where work is slowly and carefully done to restore the metal just enough so that one day they might be presented in an open-air environment. Without them, the remaining components brought up from the seafloor would have rapidly rotted and disintegrated. But Monitor's legacy does not end at the Mariners Museum. It goes far beyond that. As I mentioned, the Battle of Hampton Roads was probably the most unique naval battle of the century, and this fact didn't go unnoticed. In military history, we can trace lines where the evolution of warfare goes from gradual improvements to completely catastrophic changes that basically unseat every previous belief in what war is. We call it the Dreadnought effect, named after the British battleship HMS Dreadnought, which became the first ship that we, as observers, would recognize as a proper and well-crafted battleship. Monitor and Virginia, on the other hand, were their own Dreadnought effect. A moment where the best cannons money could buy met head-to-head in 2 unique and powerful warships, and probably, for the first time in history, ultimately failed to defeat each other. The world noticed, with Great Britain and France continuing their traditional naval arms race for decades, building gradually better ironclads until we reached the pure steel pre-dreadnoughts. America did the same at a much slower pace, as there was no interest in creating a navy as powerful as theirs. Meanwhile, the concept of the Monitor as a class of warship would be used for decades in both river and coastal service, with the Royal Navy still using ships that evolved from Ericsson's principle until the end of World War II. But it didn't stop there, as Brazil still uses large river monitors today. His design revolutionized warfare as we know it, bringing it closer to more recent memories of battleships and great cruisers, so often revered by historians now, in one great seismic shift. In other words, the Monitor wasn't just a ship that changed America, it was a ship that changed everything. So we'll leave it there for today, but I do thank you for watching. I hope you'll consider subscribing. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.